Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Eastern Approaches podcast. This is episode number 6. Last episode, we started out on a really deep dive into the empires that helped shape what is now Central and Eastern Europe and looked at the history and the nitty gritty on those empires and talked also just about some of the effects they had on social issues and cultural issues. But today, we're going to have a little bit more practical look uh, at those empires. So, in this episode, Ben's going to take a look at what all this empire talk actually means for today's traveler. So, take it away, Ben.
Okay, so kind of to wrap this empire's theme up, we want to talk about what does this mean for the traveler. History is nice and well and good, and I hope interesting to everybody, but we'll boil it down and make it kind of practical. What can you do with this if you're thinking about traveling to these parts of the world, or you have traveled to them and would love to go back? Um, some general thoughts, first of all, from me on what does this empire stuff mean for the traveler. One thing which I kind of touched on before is that the more Eastern empires, so like the Ottomans and the Tsarist Empire, they weren't that urbanized. So if you compare that with even the Habsburg Empire, but then certainly further west with, France, for example, or Germany or something, um, those Eastern empires were not that urbanized. So that means that there's fewer historic cities in those parts of the world, aside from a couple exceptions like Istanbul, St. Petersburg, Moscow. Generally speaking, there's not so many cute small towns in these eastern bits. They're not as prosperous as you might think of in France or the Netherlands or Belgium, where you have really dense urban societies, or even southern England, really dense urban societies, even into the kind of early Middle Ages, northern Italy too. And now you have all these cute and prosperous historic towns. Well, you don't get that in what is today Russia, Ukraine, Belarus so much. Not so much Turkey either, because it's just the historical development was different, and then that means kind of what excites can you expect to see there. Again, not always the small, cute, prosperous little towns, and only a few really big historic cities. But of course, there's still plenty to see, as we'll talk about. One thing that some of this historical empire influences also mean for traveler is that there's often fewer crowds the farther east you go. And Andrew and I talk about this all the time. But people flock to the big stuff in Italy and France and Spain to a certain extent. But you can see amazing imperial capitals in St. Petersburg or Moscow, where it's not quite as thronged, for example, as say the Vatican museums in Rome. I mean, the Hermitage is pretty busy, but it's maybe not as crazy making as the Vatican museums in Rome. So maybe fewer crowds overall, but there's also fewer international tourists, especially when you get outside of the capitals. And this is one of the things which, again, a common theme from us, but that I always, one reason why I love and recommend this part of the world for travel is that, you will head into some town or some village, which is probably lovely, interesting, stuff to see. And you're not going to hear a bunch of other American, Canadian, Australian, British accents, right? Like, if there's tourists, they might be more local tourists, or they might be regional tourists, right? Like people from around the Balkans going to each other's countries. And I think that's just a huge, huge bonus that you're getting to places often, the further east you go in some of these more Eastern empires, where like the international tourism is still just not at the level as it is the further west you go. And to me, that is in many ways a plus.
Yeah, it's like you have the whole place to yourself. Um, with with um, with the caveat that most of these places, we've discussed before, is English is really good. I mean, I think the further east or central you go, especially from like Mediterranean countries, there's going to be it's still going to be easy, even if there's not lots of American or English speaking tourists there. So you get the convenience of, like, okay, it's not a struggle to communicate or to buy things or whatever, and there's less tourists there. So a lot of the times, the prices you're paying are really good value. And also, I think because there's not as many tourists, then you're looked at differently,
Hmm.
and you're valued more by the locals, and it's easier to make some connections with locals as well, because it's not like they're inundated with thousands and thousands and thousands of people just kind of sleepwalking through their cities taking photos for 2 hours before they go on the bus to the next place. So I think you get a better experience, and I think you're always valued higher as a tourist by the locals there than you are if you're like, okay, you're the millionth person to come to Venice today, and if you don't
Hmm.
like it, who gives a shit, because there's a million other people coming the next day. So and I could understand there's not so much incentive when you're living in these Western countries with mass tourism to maybe to really care. So I always feel like you get a better, like, shake at kind of meeting local people there, and I think you're appreciated more.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, you totally hit the nail on the head there. Like, um, not only is there our travelers, I feel like, to some of these Eastern destinations in particular, maybe they're there more intentionally. Like, they know what they're seeing, in contrast perhaps to some of the big coach bus tours, in Western Europe, where, like, what town are we in? I don't know, but there's a statue I'm going to take a picture of, right? Like, so I think there's a kind of different mindset, um, that people have who come to some of these more Eastern places, which I think is great.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, you're right. Like, the quality of tourist, whether it's American
mhm,
or Australian or wherever it's from, is probably on a higher level. Like, they
mhm,
know more, because otherwise, they might have just skipped these places, but they were more interested in seeing something different, and perhaps they're more interested in history, and also they just don't want to be in the same places where everyone else is at. So I think you do have a smarter uh, clientele there.
yeah. And to boil it down for everybody listening, what we're saying is people who go farther east are just a better class of people.
Well, duh. I mean, it's
Duh. Yeah.
all.
Um, One thing I was also going to say, though, Andrew, kind of based on what you said, is on the language stuff. One, there's an interesting connection there also to the historical legacies of these empires, in that, yeah, English is definitely um, very useful wherever you're going to go. But man, if you've got Russian anywhere that was part of the Tsarist Empire in particular, not necessarily the Soviet Empire, but anywhere that once belonged to the Russian Empire, Russian might help you more than English, some of those places. So that helps. And then even places that belong to the Ottoman Empire, particularly interior Turkey, I've often found, like, English, yeah, it's still good to have, but that don't necessarily expect people to get very far with you with English. Some of the kind of interior empire parts, I guess I would say.
I think German would be good
Hmm.
anywhere, but just on the simple fact that Germans travel everywhere, and they have
Hmm.
always traveled. They've traveled longer in these countries than, let's say, English speaking people have. So that seems to be like and let's say in Southeast Europe, you've got so many Yugoslavs who went to Germany to work.
Hmm.
So German is, you could always find German menu. You could always, if someone in any of these countries, if they don't speak English, usually, um, I would say German would be the next best thing,
Hmm.
other than probably, maybe Baltics, and obviously
Hmm.
Russian speaking countries, even places like Poland. You've always got issues like, hey, do they
Hmm.
speak Russian? And then do they want to speak Russian?
Yeah.
Uh, but I think we need to interview some Germans at some point, because they are like, they travel, like, no matter where you go, you're like, oh yeah, just some more German
Hmm.
motorcyclist guys, doing some, like,
Yeah.
5 week trip around Eastern Europe on their bikes or whatever. So
Yeah. Well, I asked a German friend about that thing one time, like, geez, why do Germans just travel so much? And her response, note, this is a joke made by a German, okay, so don't put this one on me. She said, if you lived in Germany, Ben, wouldn't you want to get out too? Okay, that's just a joke, people. I love Germany. But anyway, um, okay, so on the some other thoughts on what does this mean for the traveler. Um, okay, so some of these Eastern empires might not have, say, the Roman Colosseum, for example, or I don't know what, um, Windsor Castle, or some of these famous kind of monuments. But I'll tell you what, there are some fantastic Roman ruins over a lot of this part of the world where the Roman Empire, especially the Western Roman Empire, once held sway. And it doesn't need to be the Colosseum, um, because there you can find interesting, barely visited, incredibly well preserved, like ruins of villas, like and Roman mosaics, like Roman country houses with their mosaic floor still intact, or just temples, which nobody hardly goes to anymore, but they're still there in some way and just a great archaeological site. So there's so much to explore that's not just like the big headline stuff of, say, the Colosseum and Roman ruins, or just the other, calendar image photos, say, Western Europe. There's so many kind of more, I don't know what, micro level, incredible uh, aspects of the heritage of the Roman Empire that are totally worth seeing, and you don't have to share them with busloads of other people.
Oh yeah, there's the you kind of, when you start, the more you start scratching there, you're like, oh wow, look at this collection of Roman ruins or whatever. Like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, you might actually get to walk around it and touch it even more so.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, I think it's definitely with castles. Like any castles or fortresses, like,
Yeah.
hey, explore your own. Like don't fall. There's like no guardrail there, and if you fall off the
Mm-hmm.
ledge, like we're someone else to pay for your funeral because we're not paying for it.
Right. Yeah,
but
exactly.
but it's kind of like, hey, whatever you want. It's not like there's all these signs like, don't do this, don't do this, don't touch this, da, da, da. Here it's like,
Mm-hmm.
hey, it's like, it's like you explore as much as you want. And I kind of like that, because you do like, oh, okay, this feels like a real fortress, because I could just kind of climb anywhere on it,
Mm-hmm.
not just be like, okay, and then I have to go to this line, and then there's this one little door I have to get in here, and everything's roped off so I can't touch it,
Mm-hmm.
thing. So yeah, it is. There's a lot more kind of hands-on, cool stuff, even if a lot of it's not on your kind of tick off box or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Your bucket list kind of crap.
Yeah, absolutely. And then last general thought is anticipate Soviet style cities anywhere that was in the Soviet Empire, especially that actually belonged to the Soviet Union. Soviet style cities, so as we call them in the Czech panelaki, so those big concrete socialist style apartment blocks. You're just going to see those a lot. Doesn't mean they're bad, right? Or bad housing, but they're just, that's what cities look like. It's the fabric of cities in this part of the world, to a certain extent. You'll see Stalinist architecture. You'll see brutalist architecture, like just the laughably bad communist architecture. A sort of urban design that just would never pass muster today. Like just even yesterday here in Prague, as I mentioned, there's some like live close to kind of a communist era housing settlement, and just walking along, and there's like no street level life. It's kind of these raised platforms you walk along, and then these big monolithic apartment blocks. And that was like thought to be good urban design by those architects in the 1960s, but like nobody would design that way today. Um, and the reason I mention this is because, you know, the empires that were here, in particular the Soviet Empire, made cities like this. And if you learn how to navigate and anticipate that kind of design of these cities, especially in kind of the outskirts, where they really developed in the 20th century, then you will appreciate them and understand them, but can just navigate them in a way because you can like know where to expect that. Okay, well maybe around there's this forest of big concrete housing blocks, but if there's a metro station or a bus station, there's also going to be a grocery store right there because that's the way these places were designed.
Yeah, and certainly, I mean, that is one good thing with a lot of the Soviet places is you do have metro, do have transport and metro systems. So these sprawling cities, you can usually just go underground and hop on a metro and get around. I mean, Budapest is like one of the easiest places,
Mm,
and Prague is as well. I guess I'm thinking maybe Prague's metro isn't as extensive as Budapest, but it was always just like if you think, oh, here's this place in my guidebook, oh, but it's outside the tourist center or the old town or whatever. You just hey, okay, just spend 2 minutes on how what you need to do to get a metro ticket and how you validate
mhm.
it or whatever, and you just get a metro map out. Nowadays you can find everything online and in English. It's like super easy, so you can really get around to see some of these places that you might be like, oh, that's far out and I don't know how to get there. So that's one nice legacy, I think, is transportation.
Yeah, yeah, and um, there may be a little bit of a learning curve to figure out how to get that metro ticket, but then you'll find, oh, that metro ticket only cost 30 cents, compared to the London Tube, for example, where like a single metro journey on the tube is going to cost you upwards of $3. So it's worth the investment to figure these infrastructures out sometimes. Um, okay, so now talking about some really specific things about what does this mean for the traveler, just some monuments, right? Again, attached to the empire from which they maybe arose or under which they arose. And again, not exhaustive, just some highlights for me and for Andrew. Some amazing, amazing Roman ruins, as we mentioned, including some stuff which is bucket list. And for me, one of the greatest um, architectural remnants of the Roman Empire anywhere is the Emperor Diocletian's palace at Split. Like, I am just endlessly fascinated by that place. That today there's a city inside a Roman emperor's palace, and you can just literally look and see kind of the flagstones that maybe the emperor once walked, and people live in an apartment just right above that, right? So Split as this incredible maze of a city inside a Roman emperor's palace is to me one of the most fascinating um, Roman ruins anywhere, and it's not in Italy, right? It's in Central and Eastern Europe.
Yeah, and staying in Croatia, I would, then say, hey, go to the Pula Arena, which is Pula is the biggest city in the Istria region of Croatia in the north, and you have the largest Roman arena outside of Italy there. They still hold some concerts, and that whole, I mean, you also have some Roman temples from, I think, second and third AD also in Pula as
Hmm.
well. Although one of the temples was like it got like I think they had to rebuild it, and then it got rebuilt
Right.
maybe in maybe I want to say Renaissance time, and then it also got rebuilt in the 20th century. So you have like some Tito Baroque, as we call it there. So it's like this second century AD Roman temple, and it's got like two or three other different architecture styles mixed in. And
Hmm.
I kind of like it like that. Like, hey, let's not like redo the whole thing and make it all kind of shiny like it was back, like made originally back in the second century, but let's just keep it there so you can kind of easily see the layers of of history in Pula. And another interesting thing about that arena was when that region was under Venice, there was talk of let's move it stone by stone to Venice. So if you
Hmm.
thought Venice had a problem with sinking now, I'm
Right.
not sure what would have happened if they're like, hey, let's just move this whole huge arena and stick it there. So fortunately, whoever vetoed that should like have their name on like a coin or something in Croatia, I think.
Yeah, there was a guy, I'm trying to forget his name, but yeah, there's this one like Venetian senator who said, yeah, this is a stupid idea. Um, okay, so other Roman Empire monuments, but the Eastern Roman Empire, so Byzantine. So there's not as much like Byzantine stuff around as kind of the Western Roman Empire, but of course the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, and some various other like Byzantine churches in Istanbul are there, and Hagia Sophia, uh, you've got to go see it. That is a total bucket list to me. Like that's the place you have to see before you die. And the fact, I was just there a few years ago for the first time, finally made it, and the fact that still sticks with me is that for about 1,000 years, 500-ish when it was first built until 1500-ish, I guess, the Hagia Sophia was the largest building in the world for 1,000 years, and that is a legacy of the Byzantine Empire. So, pretty amazing. Though there's some other stuff too, like I love Byzantine mosaics, and Ravenna, which is actually in Italy, is one of the best places for Byzantine mosaics. But there's some Byzantine mosaics actually pretty close to you, right, Andrew?
Yeah, down in Porridge in Croatia, which is once again like in this Eastrian peninsula, there's a Euphrasian basilica from 5th century, and there's some great golden mosaics there, and some other pieces to the complex that I think are 3rd and 4th century. So yeah, I haven't been to Ravenna and
Mm,
seen those mosaics, but I just looking at it, I think it's I think in the same ballpark as what
hmm
Porridge has, or Porridge is in the same ballpark as what Ravenna has. So yeah, I think you're right. There isn't as much easily noticeable Byzantine um, sites, uh, other than, of course, obviously what you're going to see in Istanbul and parts of Turkey.
hmm In terms of the Ottoman Empire, there's lots of impressive stuff. A lot of it is mosques. So there's just classic Ottoman style mosques, but some of them are really amazing and huge, not just the ones in Istanbul, though those are incredibly impressive, but Edirne in Turkey, which is just kind of across the border from Bulgaria, so firmly on the European continent, has one of the most amazing Ottoman mosques anywhere. Besides Ottoman mosques, big and small, there's all kinds of other aspects of Ottoman monuments. One of the most beautiful is, of course, the Ottoman Bridge in Mostar in Bosnia and Herzegovina, specifically over the Neretva River. I think one of the most beautiful bridges in the world, and is a really like total like trademark, I guess, for some of the grace and precision of Ottoman engineering.
I think anywhere in the Balkans, you've got a lot of really beautiful bridges. I mean, nothing that really compares so much to Mostar. Um, but you could certainly see that style of architecture. And then like Sarajevo, we were talking about earlier, it's a perfect place to see two different empires there. But
Hmm
the old Turkish quarter, with all the shops and people still working with metal and copper, like that's just so different. I mean, I think Skopje has a little bit of that in their old town, and it's been 10 years since I've been there, so I don't know how it is. But there's a lot of places in the Balkans where you get this real Ottoman vibe, and I have to say, like when I went to Istanbul the first time about 7 years ago, I had more of like, okay, I know all the Ottomans from the Balkans, and I was expecting kind of more of that there, and it wasn't, and I was, in some regards, just kind of disappointed because, like, oh, okay, yeah, maybe sometimes, you don't need to be in the epicenter or the capital of that empire, but you need to be outside of it to see their influences more.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I mean, I agree on like Skopje has a nice Ottoman quarter, and a number of other. You can find that in a number of other towns in the Balkans, like in Kosovo, for example. Prizren is another like very Ottoman kind of feeling town. So a lot of ways to kind of connect to that empire's heritage. Um, Venice. So keep your eyes open anywhere in the Eastern Mediterranean for that winged lion of St. Mark. So the symbol of Venice. And I guarantee you will see that winged lion stamped in all kinds of places you might not be expecting, because these Venice was all over the place in the Eastern Mediterranean. And when you recognize that winged lion, you'll say, aha, this was Venice. And I think in particular, just to mention one like Venetian monument in eastern parts of Europe, and that is Rhodes, right? So the island of Rhodes, this enormous medieval fortress built up at Rhodes. A lot of it is like Venetian fortress architecture, and you'll find the Venetian lion stamped there as testament to this was Venice. So, Venice didn't necessarily build churches or aqueducts or, great art throughout its empire, but it definitely built some pretty impressive military architecture, and it built like often like town halls and city gates where you'll find that winged lion stamped.
Yeah, you could really go anywhere, and if you go anywhere in Croatia on the coast and Montenegro too, it's hard not to see the winged
Hmm.
lion. So yeah, I mean, like I think Kotor in Montenegro, that's got the wall around it. It's like it's actually very different than Dubrovnik, even though like these two walled cities on the water are very
Hmm.
close to each other. In Dubrovnik, that was not Venice, or certainly it was built up not from Venice, but Kotor was. So you can see uh, their stamp, that whole Bay of Kotor area in Montenegro.
Hmm. And then for the Habsburgs, I mean, there's so much you could talk about because anywhere that was the Habsburg Empire, the cities also often have kind of um, a characteristic look. At least the parts that were built up in the 19th century, and I always like mentioning, like, look at the theaters because almost every Habsburg city of any size got a major theater, which was like the opera house and the ballet theater, and where you had high culture, and almost all of them were designed by this Vietnamese Viennese firm called Helma und Fellner, and they all kind of look alike, these elaborate wedding cake pieces of architecture. But look at those; that's a Habsburg stamp. I just wanted to mention, though, just to zoom in on one example of like Habsburg monuments, is stand on the Danube in Budapest, and you can see the parliament right there in the river. You look across at Buda at Castle Hill, which is now sort of a hodgepodge of rebuilt historical stuff, but all the kind of grand buildings from right around 1900 in Budapest. All that is from the time of Austria-Hungary. The last apogee zenith of the Habsburg Empire, and that kind of grandeur and opulence. Budapest is just a great symbol of this, the power and multicultural, like cultural attributes of this great Central European monarchy, the Habsburg monarchy.
Yeah, and you could see, you can go to kind of all the corners of that empire. So you can go all the way west to Adriatic, and you could see Trieste, which is so much more a Habsburg city than an Italian one. I always say it's the least Italian city that I've ever seen,
Mm,
because well, it had very little to do with Italy. That's why when it was
right.
built. You can go very very east and get into Lviv and even Chernovtsi, which is in more southwest or south central Ukraine. And if you were just dropped off there blindfolded and you looked around, you would for sure not think you're in Ukraine. I think it looks so much like Austria and
Mm,
Czech there.
mm,
And then if you go further south, then you run into Sarajevo, and then like we mentioned, you've got that dividing line, and all of a sudden it's like, okay, there's the Turkish quarter, and it ends, and right here you can see late 19th century Habsburgs building that part. So you can go all these different directions from Vienna or from this kind of the center of Europe and just see their influences.
yeah, kind of like the winged lion with Venice. There's just this Habsburg style from the late 1800s. In fact, one joke, which can't remember if I've used this one on an episode before, but one joke I heard once is, um, what is the definition of Central Europe? And the answer is, it's where all the big public buildings are yellow, because there was this Habsburg color called Kaisergelb, or imperial yellow, Maria Theresia yellow. And just like Andrew's saying, you can go to the far flung corners of what was once the Habsburg monarchy, and you're just going to see this kind of style. And I bet you that, like, the big buildings, like the post office building, or maybe the train station, or like the city hall or something, it's going to be painted yellow because that was the color of big public buildings in Habsburg monarchy. Okay, so as my last monument, one from the Soviet Empire, and that is the crazy amazing statue of Radina Mach, like the motherland statue in Kiev in Ukraine. Think, if you've never seen it, think kind of like, I don't know, what a Soviet Statue of Liberty. Uh, it's actually a World War II monument, really. The sacrifices of the motherland to defeat fascism. And there's a whole kind of Soviet holdover World War II museum and like the base of the statue. But it's this great silver lady holding like a sword out overlooking the Dnieper River in Kiev. And you can go up in the statue too and like look out of it. It really is like, I don't know how it compares size wise to the Statue of Liberty, but that's kind of the feel. Just this huge metal lady, metal communist lady in this case, and that is absolutely a monument from a vanished empire, like all these other ones, because it does acknowledge, the Soviet Union's important role in defeating Hitler, but then kind of the aesthetics and symbolism of that statue are just as if it might be, Pula's amphitheater or something. It's just a reflection of a time that has vanished, and that I found pretty fascinating.
Would that be similar to what's in Tbilisi? Because
Mm,
they've got the statue of the woman holding the sword, and she's also
mhm.
holding out, I want to say, some food, or is she holding out some water, like kind of like we will help you, but we also have the sword. And I don't know if that was a Soviet thing or if that was there beforehand.
Yeah, I think that one in Tbilisi is not a Soviet monument, or anyway, it's certainly a different like purpose to that monument. And the one in Kiev is bigger too, is my
Oh,
recollection.
okay.
Yeah, so pretty impressive though. And yeah, and like I said, vanished age. Um, okay, so that's some monuments. Another topic for like what do these empires mean for the traveler, though, is just getting around. Like, there's actually influences from these empires on what it's like traveling in these parts of the world based on like infrastructure. To boil it down, the farther west you are, the better train connections are going to be because the Habsburgs built up the rail network much better than certainly the Ottomans, because the Ottomans didn't do very much of anything. And but then even like the Tsarist Empire, yeah, there's trains, but it's much denser and generally speaking much better anywhere there was Habsburg. Better roads typically too. Um, and Andrew, I knew you've had experience like with trains in the Balkans and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, yeah, in the Balkans, yeah, because the Ottomans, I don't know what, I don't think they built much at all. But some places like the Balkans, it's also the terrain and geography because it's
Mm,
just it's hard to build. So Central Europe, if you think most of the places of the Habsburgs, it's relatively flat. I mean, you might have mountain ranges you go through, but the terrain in general is a bit more flat than in the Balkans. So. I think some of it is the Habsburgs obviously weren't on in the Balkans very long,
hmm
and the Ottomans didn't do much with building up trains, and then you just have the actual terrain itself there that kind of plays into the fact that it's the infrastructure is not so good.
Yeah. Um, one thing that I would love to do someday. So anybody who's listening, if you want to hire Andrew and me to be your guides, is to take a boat around what used to be the Venetian Empire, kind of charter your own boat, because to really see, to connect the old Venetian outposts, you'd need a boat, but that would be an amazing, amazing trip around the Adriatic and Eastern Mediterranean
Yeah, like
someday.
Venice to Rhodes or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, that would be super sexy. Um, One other thing I was just thinking about, though, in terms of like the legacy of these empires for getting around, is where the Roman Empire was, the Western Roman Empire, still a lot of the times, some of the main roads follow old Roman roads. So if you wanted to, you could kind of dig into some of the history and find out, aha, this was the Via Egnatica or something like that, one of these major Roman roads. And there's even places where you can actually go and see the actual Roman road itself. Like I know even right outside of Split, in the old Roman settlement of Solian, like you can see bits of the old Roman road. So, the infrastructure of the past empire can actually become one of the monuments or one of the tourist attractions today.
And not to keep going back to Istria, but Istria is a perfect example. If you there's a at the museum at the Pula Arena, there's a map of the Roman
Hmm.
roads, all of Istria, Roman roads, and all the towns, all the settlements the Romans did. And the only thing that has changed is some of those roads are now highways and asphalted, and
Hmm.
the names of some of the towns have changed, but nothing else has. So everything the Romans built as far as the roads go, it's the exact same. And where they built cities and towns, that's what's still there. I mean,
Hmm.
there's certain parts like on the eastern part of Istria Peninsula, the Romans didn't build, and still today there's nothing there. So it was like, hey, like they had it all figured out by the time they were crumbling. They had everything in that region figured out, and nothing's really changed other than the modern style of the roads and highways there.
Yeah, that's pretty incredible. Um, so another thing you need to think about for a traveler in relation to these empires is borders, right? If you're used to traveling in, Central and Western Europe, you don't even think about borders anymore because most of the time you just cross country to country and don't even show your passport. However, first of all, if it was part of the Tsarist Empire, it's not in the European Union. There's, I think, one categorical statement. I know that's not true because the Baltics are. So Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were in the Tsarist Empire, and they're in the EU. But with that exception, and Finland, I guess, is debatable. So now I'm backtracking. But um, you're going to encounter borders if it was part of the Tsarist Empire, and in particular, maybe more relevant, if it was part of the Soviet Union, you might still need a visa. So forget just rocking up to a country's airport and getting to enter. Some of the countries, especially like as you get into Central Asia, but I think even Azerbaijan, maybe you have to like consider visa stuff before you even go there.
Yeah, exactly. Although, I mean, I think they've streamlined it. So I had to get a
Mm,
visa because I went into Azerbaijan by land, but if I flew into Baku, I think I could have got one on arrival. I'm not
yeah.
100% sure. And actually, not that too many people are going to Belarus right now, but I believe in the last 3 or 4 years, hey, you fly into Minsk, you get like a 72-hour
Hmm.
like stay for free or something like that, or you get the 72-hour visa if like upon arrival. But yes, in general, yeah, you've got more visas to deal with, or just more border checks because, as you said, I think other than Finland and Baltics, then everything else that was part of the Soviet Empire is not at all in Schengen.
Yeah. Another kind of empire thing, just as a categorization, is that if it was part of the Ottoman Empire, it's probably not in the European Union. Bulgaria and Greece are the exceptions here. Romania also sort of too, though Romania was never fully conquered by the Ottomans. But that's a simple thing to mention, but it actually tells you something about the history. Is it like there's still, because of that old imperial dividing line, that's still kind of a dividing line in some ways, and it even points to the fact that it's actually in some ways kind of weird that Bulgaria and Romania are in the European Union because a lot of people said they weren't ready to join when they did join. But that civilizational line is in some ways still intact.
Yeah, I think I think it also just shows you that, hey, if you were under Ottoman Empire, you were not as well off, and so and
Mm,
that obviously plays and you're not maybe with your laws and bureaucracy and other stuff, you're not up to whatever the EU requires. So it's not a
mhm.
surprise that. all these Balkan countries. I mean, Croatia is like kind of Balkan, but not certainly not fully, and nor was it fully under the Ottoman Empire. And
Hmm.
same with Slovenia. And those are the two countries, let's say from Southeast Europe, Balkans area the that are in the EU. And as you mentioned, Greece and Bulgaria. And with Bulgaria and Romania, it was definitely, I think people questioned at the time if they were ready. And I think if if they were going to get voted in today, if they were at the same stage they were in 2006, they for sure would have not gotten in.
Yeah, yeah, it would have been controversial. I think getting them in today is hugely controversial.
I think you need like it has to be unanimous. So
Mm, hmm.
uh, there would be more than one country that would veto
Yeah,
that for sure.
indeed. And Andrew, I think you had a point about like finding things that are west in the Balkans, something like that.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. So yeah, one thing that's kind of interesting is sometimes you can go more east geographically speaking and find more Western things. As I mentioned, with some of these cities in Ukraine, like Chernovtsi and Lviv, those are, you know, like I said, you could think you could fool yourself into thinking you're in Czech Republic or maybe even Hungary or Austria, because even though they're quite east, they're more Habsburgian. And then you can go far less east, more just south, and then you're in the Balkans, and then you find things that are far more Eastern, just with mosques and Ottoman architecture and things like that. So it doesn't necessarily, it doesn't always correlate to the actual geography, because you can have these Western feeling places east and more Eastern feeling places
Hmm.
not really not so far east, but more just south.
Yeah, interesting. Um, a last kind of category for me in terms of thinking about the influence of these empires on travel today is the question of can you even go there, right? Um, One unfortunate thing is that there's some places with interesting Roman ruins that are now inaccessible, like Libya, say, or Syria, because of the kind of conflict situation in those places. You know, those both those places were actually part of both the Ottoman and the Roman empires, and I'm sure have monuments from interesting places to see from both imperial pasts. But you know, nobody should really be traveling for pleasure to Libya or Syria right now, unfortunately. Um, Another thing I was thinking about in terms of this, can you even go there? Is there's places on the edges of what was once the Tsarist and Soviet empires, what I think Russians would call like the near abroad, where there's still trouble. Where, frankly, I mean, Vladimir Putin's regime often creates trouble. Things like Eastern Ukraine, which is, you know, a frozen conflict. These little bits of debatably Georgia, like Abkhazia and Ossetia, frozen conflict. The bit of Moldova, called, or next to Moldova, called Transnistria, wants to be its own country. Um, these are places which, I mean, Abkhazia and Ossetia, I know, have amazing landscapes. They might not be high on your travel list, but um, they are places that it's very difficult to go anyway, in part because they are on these edges of empires and they're like still unstable and still kind of conflictual for various geopolitical reasons today.
Yeah, and some of them you can only get in from one side,
Hmm.
or like if you're went to Abkhazia, you could go from Georgia, but you certainly couldn't go back. So then you're like, okay, well, then I'm going to need a Russian visa, because the only way out is just going into Russia proper and getting out that way. And a lot of these little autonomous regions, they're not even recognized by Russia. It's like,
Hmm.
yeah, because if you think about it, it's like, yeah, if you're Russia, you're like, well, yeah, it's great if South Ossetia is not part of Georgia, but we don't actually want them in our own country. It's just good for us, to have this conflict and to have this maybe buffer zone with Georgia. But like, what would Russia get out of having? Hey, now we have a new oblast or whatever, South
Hmm.
Ossetia. Like, we don't want that. So then they're just kind of no man's land, and then you have the whole area that's being fought over in the last few weeks in
Hmm.
Armenia and Azerbaijan, and that's also this no man's land that got probably further messed up by the whole Soviet Empire. I mean, that's probably one of the main reasons why there's a conflict there. Um, and yeah, but it's like but it's not like Armenia is like, oh, this is part of Armenia. It's not. So I mean, it's a decent chunk of land, and it's not part of any country.
Mm. Yeah, complicated. And I was thinking about Crimea too, right? Like the Crimea is a place that I would love to go visit, and I think there's a fair bit to see there. Interestingly, a place that was also on the edges of empire, since that was at least connected to the Ottoman Empire in one way or another for a while, and there's an indigenous Muslim population there. But you know, it's been annexed by Russia, which is not acknowledged by most countries in the world, at least as of the time we're talking. And I don't know how difficult it is for foreign travelers to get into Crimea, but that's one of these post-imperial places of instability that is probably off the travel list for a good long while, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think you can go there if you have a Russian visa. The problem
Mm,
is then you'd have to go back the way you came, because
hmm.
Ukraine would not let you in. You couldn't go into Ukraine if you've been into
Hmm.
Crimea, just like this Nagorno Karabakh eh,
Yeah.
region that's getting fought over. If if I went there before I went into Azerbaijan, I mean, I had to answer questions, and I was like, no, I didn't go there, and I didn't. But if you went if you went into that disputed region, then you could not get let into Azerbaijan. They just wouldn't let you in, and that's the way it is with Crimea and Ukraine. So I think for a future episode, I will talk about my travels in Crimea,
Mm, okay.
because that was definitely one of the most interesting areas or regions that I'd ever been in, and I was extremely looking forward to a second visit when I moved to Europe. And I think 2 months before I moved to Europe is when I got annexed, and that was like, well, there goes my summer travel plans.
Right.
But it is amazing, and I don't know if it'll ever be you'll ever be able to travel in it again. But I'd love to talk about it sometime, because you really see a lot of different empires and cultures
Hmm.
in a small area there.
So yeah, I'd love to hear about that. I haven't heard your Crimea stories, and I would love to hear about those. And actually, another example that just I just thought of is where can you go and where can you not go, and just ease of travel. And it also connects to empires and kind of geopolitics of today and the past. Is at least earlier this year when I was in Turkey and before the pandemic and was thinking of going to Armenia, like you can't cross land borders from Turkey to Armenia, and you can't even fly from Turkey to Armenia. At least there were no flights when I was looking early in the year because of like historic bad blood between Turkey and Armenia, both once ruled by the Ottoman Empire. But of course, the Armenian genocide in the early part of the 20th century, um, terrible historic occurrence that still today makes travel between those two countries effectively impossible.
Yeah. So Ben, my last take on this whole topic of empires is kind of my personal, like, ironic take on it. As a traveler, and where I run tours and what I'm interested in, for sure the three empires that I'm most interested in and traveled mostly in would be Soviet Empire, Ottoman Empire, and Habsburgs. And if we could pick a capital for each of those, I think you would agree that for Soviet Empire that would be Moscow, for Ottoman Empire that would be Istanbul, and for Habsburg Empire that would be Vienna. Does that sound right?
Yeah, sure.
The ironic thing is, those three cities are probably the least interesting places for me. So, so I mean, the first time I was in Moscow, I spent about a week there, and I'm glad I did. There's a lot to see, but in the 21 years since, I've only been back to like catch a train or fly into the
Hmm.
airport or whatever. It's really not my cup of tea. I'm definitely more a St. Petersburg kind of guy.
Hmm.
If I don't know. I always figured that St. Petersburg and Moscow would be, I don't know, maybe New York and San Francisco, or LA and New York, or
Mm,
something like that. I'm
hmm.
definitely the St. Petersburg kind of guy. With the Habsburg Empire, once again, I've been to Vienna probably a few times for maybe 5 or 6 days, but I swear, for that kind of classic big Central European city, give me Budapest, give me
Hmm.
Prague, give me Krakow. I don't know what it is, but the allure there is just, it's not there for me.
Interesting.
Um, and for Istanbul, I guess I spent so much time in all these Ottoman uh, territories, countries now in Europe, that when I got there, it was so crowded. And I had
Hmm.
kind of Istanbul 1960s running through my head, because I would watch these films from that kind of golden age of travel. And I was like, this is what Istanbul is going to be like. And it's going to be kind of like some of these places I went in the Balkans. And then you're stuck in Blue Mosque with 3,000 people, and you have 10 minutes to do everything. And then you need to move on. And
Hmm.
every two steps you take, someone's trying to sell you something. So, and I would definitely go back to Istanbul, but it was just kind of disappointing, because I guess I had all these, been to these other Ottoman places, and had this different view in my head of what it used to be like, and it definitely wasn't like that in the 21st century.
Huh. Interesting. Well, I mean, I'm a little surprised on some of that stuff. I get especially the Budapest thing, and that I feel like places like Budapest or Prague have an immediate wow value that Vienna doesn't, just because of their setting. Um, the Istanbul one, yeah, it's a huge megalopolis, and it has some downsides. But man, I just feel like there's so much history there, and it's such a uh, amazing setting that I don't know. Maybe it's like the magic is hard to get because it's so crowded, and there's a lot of tourists and that kind of stuff. But for me, that's a place where it's definitely worth digging for the magic to find it.
Oh yeah, and I definitely would recommend all three of these places, and probably
Hmm.
Istanbul over the other three. And I want to go back and see more. I think it was this combination of, like, I'd been to all these Ottoman places, but never the home of the Ottomans, and it was,
Hmm.
so I was like more, just, I don't know, more used to like what I'd seen in the Balkans per se. And also, yes, it was the last week of August, and that's when I had to
Oh
go
yeah.
with the tour group. And it wasn't, it wasn't Venice, it wasn't like Dubrovnik with 5 cruise ships in port.
Hmm.
But because it's a big city, so it obviously can absorb the people. But it was just, I think I had this ideal in my head of what it was going to be like, and it wasn't like that. So I need to go back, and that's been 7 years now. So I think I'll go back next time, not expecting any of the stuff I did before, and that'll probably give me a better experience there.
Yeah. Well, as always, it's about expectations. What you go in with, but I think it is an interesting perspective, on sometimes maybe the imperial capitals are actually not the what end up being the travel highlights for some people.
Yeah, and I think when we go into future episodes with talking about second cities and non-capital cities, I think we could just discuss more of that, because
Hmm.
certainly, and I say certainly, like, almost all capitals are worth visiting, whether or not they're the actual highlight of the country or of that old empire. Kind of is a different matter.
So that has been our look at some of the historic empires in Central and Eastern Europe, what they have meant in terms of their influence on society, politics, economics, culture, and then even the influence still today on what it means to travel in these places. A lot of these themes, I think, we'll keep on coming back to, just what is the influence of some of these places today? What can you see from these historical empires in some of the places, the destination focused topics that Andrew and I will do in the future. But I hope this has been a useful kind of historical dive, and including some practical aspects of what the empire's influence is on traveling in this part of the world.
So last episode, I alluded to that I would give a little talk on how to capture the essence of travel if you're just in your own hometown, like when you get back from traveling and you know you can't travel for a while, that kind of like, oh, it's a downer, and you feel like, oh, I'm back in this other dimension, or I'm back in the old rat race. So just an idea of like how to maybe keep in touch with the travel community while you're in your hometown, and to meet other travelers that are visiting your town, just like you were visiting their cities and other places. So one of the things I did when I first got back from my big 6 month travel was I thought, where did I meet most of these other travelers? Well, I stayed at hostels mainly. So I went to the big international youth hostel in Seattle, which used to be at the Pike Place Market. And I just went in and I said, hey, can I volunteer for something here? Is there something I could do? And they said, oh, yeah, there's a concierge desk. So you can give out information, give recommendations of places to go or where to eat, kind of explain maps, look at all the events going on, sports or music or other things. So you could just talk with people. And I would volunteer, I don't know, a couple times a week for 2 or 3 hours. And then I would get to meet all these different travelers into Seattle and give them, help them out, just like other people helped me out when I was traveling in Europe. And some of that led to things like, oh, hey, we've got tickets for sporting events. So if you want to take a group of, of travelers to a baseball game, for instance, you can.
Mm.
So then I would volunteer for that. And then I realized quickly, like, hopefully I'll take all the Koreans and Japanese, because then I don't have to explain much to them, because they already know
Right.
everything about baseball. And
Mm.
of course, this is like when Seattle had Ichiro, so most of them already wanted to go anyway to see their player. And then it was interesting when I would take the Europeans, the Australians to baseball, like how much I have to explain, or like, God,
Hmm.
this is kind of silly. Like, why are all there these so many rules? And then you learn a little bit too, just about what things are similar to cricket, for example, because I don't
Hmm.
know anything about cricket. So I know I had some Indians once and some Aussies, and I would be like, okay, what are the similarities and the differences? So that would be one thing I would say is, if you could volunteer somewhere, or at a hostel, that's a great place to get in touch with travelers.
Hmm.
Another thing to do is, whatever countries you went to, see if like they have local communities where you live. And just by chance, there was a guy came to fix the copy machine at the law firm I was working with, and he had some accent. And I said, "Oh, excuse me, are you Russian?" And of course, he's like, "No, I'm Polish." And I was like, "Oh shit."
Uh-oh. Yeah.
Uh, but he wasn't offended. And I said, "Oh, hey, I just got back from this trip, and I've been to these places in Poland, and blah 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 blah." And he's like, "Oh, there's a Polish community center that
Mm.
has dinners on Friday nights." And I was like, "No, I have no idea." And when he told me where it was like 3 blocks from where I lived, up on Capitol Hill. Um, so then I was like, okay, I'll go to this. And it was great. You go on a Friday night, and when I first started going, it was mainly just Polish speaking people, whether they were younger people speaking Polish, or older generations
Hmm.
there. And then you got in on all the food that you liked, and whatever Polish vodka, things like that, Polish beer. So that was like something, of course it was right around the corner from me, and I didn't know about it. So it was kind of nice to tap into the local community
Hmm.
to get things like that. And then the last thing I bring up is just all these different kind of arts, culture, food things that go on, like festivities, or film fests or whatever, in your own backyard. So, I just noticed, hey, here's Orthodox church. I knew where the Orthodox churches were, and they would have festivals or holidays, and for sure you can go there and you're going to get borscht, or some
Right.
pierogies, or some paninis, or whatever it is, and probably maybe hear some of the languages from those countries. Or you go to the film festival, like I used to a lot, and it was like the more obscure and smaller the country the film came from, like the better the chance that you would for sure meet people. Whether they're, I mean, most of them, of course, are immigrants, living now in the U.S., but you would always hear them talking their language, because they're for sure going to go see that one film from their country that, it's like every 5 years there's one film from like Kyrgyzstan. So
Mm.
that makes it to America and you can meet them there. Or you could even kind of check up on cultural things. I found an Estonian choir group, which Baltics are famous for their choral music, and they were coming to University of Washington for a performance. So I went and got a ticket. This is like the first, I probably hadn't been to the Baltics for 3 or 4 years, and this is my only chance to get some little flavor of that culture that I enjoyed there. And then, of course, I ended up meeting the people who were going to this. There were quite a few of Baltic heritage, and then
Hmm.
you have an interesting conversation because they're like, what, you've been to my home country, why would you do that?
Right.
Those are just some ideas of how you can kind of uh, relive and get back in touch with either the communities or some of the other travelers in your own hometown.
And I can add one too, which I will admit doesn't come from personal experience because I've never used it, but I have heard that it can be good, and that is couch surfing. So the website, I think it's couchsurfing.com. People use it sometimes, when they're just like looking for a free place to stay. And it might not just be international travelers, but I've also heard that um, there's like couch surfing meetups, and so they'll organize in any kind of town. Hey, anybody who's in town right now want to meet up at XYZ bar this evening for drinks or something like that. And I think especially in some of the more popular or destinations that see more travelers, especially from more likely to attract people from outside of the country, whichever country we're living in, that these couch surfing events might actually draw some people from far away. And so it's kind of potentially another good way to meet travelers, even if you're staying home. I've also heard that sometimes couch surfing stuff can be a little sketchy if you're staying in somebody's home. Again, I haven't experienced it, but I'm presumably the sketchy occasions are the minority. But if you have a strong opinion about couch surfing, you can leave us a message on Anchor and give us a diatribe.
Well, Ben, I think that wraps up this rather long episode. We had a lot to talk about on this one.
Thanks for listening, everybody. Until next time.